Take a look at this map. Do you notice something different? At first sight, it's just a map of Europe and Africa with some islands to the west, right? Well, take a closer look at the islands depicted in red and blue on the right side of the map. These are the Antilha Islands, meaning islands opposite to the west coast of Europe. For centuries they have been thought about as just some mythical islands from the 14th century that, although depicted in some maps at the time, were never seen again in later trips across the Atlantic. But what if I told you that these islands aren't mythical at all? In fact, they are very much real and still at their original place. This map, made in 1424 by the Venetian cartographer João Pizzigano with Portuguese reports, made European historians scratch their heads when it was found in an ancient library in 1953. Although the Pizzigano map was made 60 years before Columbus officially stepped foot in the Bahamas, it's clear that it depicts a big landmass west of the Iberian peninsula, when at the time no one even imagined such possibility. You're probably thinking right now, okay, so what? That map is probably fake. There's no way people knew about the existence of the New World more than half a century before Columbus. Well, let me clear your doubts. Here are 6 other maps, all with similar depictions of the same island I just mentioned. This island also went by the name of Isle of Seven Cities. It originates from an old Iberian legend, set during the Muslim conquest of Hispania in 714 AD. Seeking to flee the Muslim conquerors, 7 Christian Visigothic bishops embarked with their flocks on ships and set sail westwards into the Atlantic Ocean, eventually landing on an island where they founded 7 settlements. But let's not lose track of the topic. In the Pizzigano map, if you follow the studies of historians and give some slack to the 500-year-old mapping techniques, you can identify several known landmasses depicted in it. First, let's look at the island with the description of Bahamas, which is argued to be modern-day Andros in the Bahamas. Funnily enough, the exact island Columbus first landed in his famous trip. Second, there's Inma, which looks quite similar to modern-day Prince Edward Island. Then there's Satanazes, similar to nowadays the Avalon Peninsula. Further north, there's the easily recognizable Half Moon, which even today's sailors often recognize it as being the south tip of Greenland. Then there's the Round Island, also known as Iceland. And last but not least, there's the Antilha, the more interesting of the bunch, and arguably quite similar to nowadays Nova Scotia and Canada. Everything seems to be matching up surprisingly well, but we still have a missing piece. So let's move forward a few decades to the map of Columbus, made in 1490, just after his first trip. Columbus has referred multiple times that the island of the 7 cities was a Portuguese discovery. He even paid respect to this by naming the cities on his map in Portuguese. But if in previous maps the mystic island didn't quite look like a real island compared to the satellite images, with this new drawing the similarities were striking. If you place on top of each other the outlines of the island of the 7 cities and the real satellite images of what is now New Scotia, you can identify the 3 different pieces of land, the water streams flowing in between them, and especially the distinct bays all shown in the correct locations. The claims that the island is not proportional and out of place are just an attempt from the King of Portugal to hide them, because in the famous Cantino map in 1501 they are much more accurately presented. The Cantino map is quite literally one of the most beautiful and historically relevant maps ever made in history. This amazing planisphere was made in Portugal in 1501 and unfortunately stolen by Italian spies in the following year. The top half of the map shows 3,000 kilometers of coastline, all the way from Mexico, passing through from Louisiana, Florida, and ending up just before the state of Virginia up north. Keep in mind that officially Virginia would only be discovered 11 years later. Then, the bottom left of the map shows 8,000 kilometers of coastline, including the Antilles, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, as well as a huge part of South America with drawings of Portuguese flags, local tribe members, and the flora present in the region. In total, the Cantino map displays an astonishing 11,000 kilometers of American shoreline, which in and of itself it's already astonishing, but wait until you hear this. The map is drawn following specific standards and rules invented by the Portuguese to help set common rules to all the cartographers in the country and make the process of mapping discoveries much faster and straightforward. So when you consider the map was finished in 1501 and was made using these standards, with detailed drawings of Brazil, which officially had only been discovered 1 year prior, it's ridiculous to believe Portugal wasn't already mapping America many years before the rest of Europe. Just as a comparison, let's look at the mapping of the African coast. The west coast of Africa was also mapped in the 15th century, so the ships and sailing techniques were virtually the same, with a big advantage of distance, seeing that to map the African coast, you could depart from Lisbon and would have settlements in Morocco and all the way to South America, with the existing civilizations on the way. The African coast took 73 years to be mapped in detail, all the way from 1415 to 1488, and considering that it too was a length roughly the same size as the American coast being depicted in the Cantino map, it's simply stupid to state that the latter was mapped in 1.5 years. Ships weren't very fast at the time, some couldn't even survive the round trip to America, such is the case with Columbus Santa Maria, so even if everything went right, the correct calculations of when Portugal started to map the American continent give an estimate of at least the halfway point of the 15th century. In the Cavario Planisphere, made in 1504 and stored in Italy till this day, it's perfectly visible the text saying land of Gonçalo Coelho on the coast of Brazil, where it's a fact he performed his trip to this part of the world well before 1487. Another example of why history should be rewritten is Florida. Florida was mapped in 4 different maps before official discovery. Critics suggest that it was discovered by Spanish, but when you look at the maps and letters sent to the king, it's clear that they didn't know about its position as well as the Portuguese did. In the Cantino map, the Portuguese wrote Castilian names on top of Florida because the king wanted to avoid stir with the Spanish king, seeing that in the Tordesillas Treaty, Portugal wasn't allowed to explore this part of the world. The historian John Irony himself wrote a thesis about the pre-discovery of America by the Portuguese. In it, he states that on the Walt-C-Muller's map, it's clear the Portuguese already knew about the Pacific Ocean, as well as the Panama Canal, the Andes mountain range, the Sierra Nevada mountains in the US, and even the west coast of Canada. For all these discoveries spanning almost 19,000 kilometers, the historian calculated that the date of the first contact had to be at least 1481, not accounting for shipwrecks, the time that information took to arrive to Walt C. Muller, the time that it took to fabricate the map, the much bigger effort and damage the ships took when compared to exploring the African coast, and time wasted lost at sea repairing the ships. For example, Columbus himself, on his first trip, lost the ship Santa Maria, and almost lost the ship Nina and Pinta in what is arguably a much shorter trip than if he were to explore South America or the other side of the American continent. And the ships couldn't count on local civilizations to restock supply. So, the most probable date was determined to be 1477 by the historian. This date coincides exactly to 2 years before the Treaty of Alcáçovas, but why does that matter? Well, you see, in this treaty made in 1479, there was an odd proposal by the Portuguese that would only make sense to the rest of Europe a few years later. Basically, the Portuguese claimed that every island or land to the west and south of the Canary Islands would belong to the Portuguese kingdom. This claim would only be of significance if you knew there was land in that region, and so everybody in Europe agreed, not knowing the full details. Arguably, the Portuguese were the only sailors in the world to be able to explore such vast distances at the time. Previous to the late 15th century, where King Fernando and Queen Isabel of Spain officially gave order to the start of the Spanish era of long-distance exploration, Portugal was the clear dominant at sea when it came to ocean currents, ship technology, sailing techniques, and overall sailing capabilities. Spain wasn't even close. Another episode that can give us a hint that Portugal already knew about the islands to the west, previous to the rest of Europe, happened in 1493. The Pope Alexander had just given to Spain the right to every land west of Cape Verde. He drew an imaginary line of 100 leagues cutting right through the Atlantic Ocean and tried to divide the world into two, but the Portuguese king wasn't having any of it. He quickly gathered arguments and stormed to the Vatican City, arguing against the Pope's decision, which gave start to diplomatic talks between Portugal and Spain, and soon later, in 1494, in the famous Treaty of Tordesillas, this imaginary line along the Atlantic Ocean was moved 270 leagues west, which conveniently now allowed Portugal to claim Brazil. The lack of documentation is the most argued point against the theory of pre-Columbus finding of the New World, but even this can be refuted. In 1555, Lisbon woke up to one of the deadliest and most destructive events in history. The earth started shaking, full buildings started crumbling to the ground, fires ignited all throughout the city due to the intensive use of candles for illumination, and if this wasn't enough, a massive tsunami made sure to finish the job and bring the almighty capital of the Portuguese Empire to its knees. It's still visible today in the few remaining buildings the level of destruction that this event brought to the city, and it's also clear that a lot of precious documents, books and official exploration reports were forever lost to the same sea who gave Portugal so many opportunities. Add to this event the Philippine dynasty who made sure to sell and get rid of valuable Portuguese documents, and the Inquisition who burned every paper even remotely scientific, and you start to understand how it is possible that this thesis has simply been lost to time. I know the video is getting long, but I still have a few amazing stories about this era. It's reported that the King John II of Portugal told Columbus about firm lands south of the Canary Islands, and that there was a big continent in the region. At the time, firm land meant that it wasn't an island, and big continent, well, it means the same as today. And that's when Columbus became so obsessed with exploration to the west of the Iberian Peninsula and years later set sail to Cuba. To me, one of the coolest evidence that Portuguese navigators were there before Columbus were the objects found on these lands that officially shouldn't be there. Fernando Columbus, son of the man himself, when writing his father's biography, mentioned that there were reports from the first men to have officially found Guadalupe, that they found an iron pan and pieces of wood from European ships being used by local tribes to cook food just like it would happen if they were taught by previous Europeans. Keep in mind that the civilizations at the time weren't in the Iron Age and had no way of producing iron tools. Arguments against these reports try to disprove it by saying that it was possible that a ship sailing along the coast of Africa could have wrecked and that the wreckage could have reached these tribes with some tools still in it, just like nowadays we can find pieces of plastic bottles and fishing nets from around the world. The thing to keep in mind is that in the 15th century there were barely any ships sailing in the Atlantic Ocean when compared to the number of fishing nets and plastic floating around today, and the probability of iron tools to survive these vast distances on top of a piece of wood without sinking on the way is minuscule. Even Christopher Columbus himself reported that on his third trip to the Caribbean, a local tribe member came aboard the ship on its arrival with a besta, clearly from European origins, although this part of the island had supposedly never been touched by Europeans. And this wasn't everything. On his fourth and final trip to this part of the world, in what is today Panama, Columbus was amazed to find ruins of a building made out of stone unlike any other building he had came across in this part of the world. Usually, any man-made structure in this region was made out of wood sticks and leaves, but this one was much sturdier. It was made by cold stone, a type of stone that can only be built by heating up cold stone up to 1000 degrees Celsius and requires a good understanding of the process. Critics were quick to point out that there was in fact a civilization capable of building these types of structures in the region. The Mayans were known to be really good builders and they used to construct facilities in the same type of stone, but they weren't known for coming this far south to modern-day Panama. The closest evidence of the Mayan civilization was more than 1000 kilometers of thick jungle away, and in particular in the interior of the continent. This structure was found near the coast, just upstream of a nearby river, but the Mayans usually preferred to settle deep into the jungle, with their biggest cities Chichén Itzá, Mayapan and Copan all being located away from the coastline. Oh, and did you notice that I said the Spanish found ruins of this building? Well, material experts state that this type of stone building are quite resilient and only start to become ruins a few decades after being abandoned, meaning that it had to be built roughly in the middle of the 15th century, decades before any European navigators officially reached the New World. There's a famous Spanish writer named Bartolomé de las Casas, son of a Spanish navigator that accompanied Columbus on his second trip to the Caribbean and later wrote 5 novels about his historic trip, where in it he mentions that the indigenous people of these islands told the crew that they had been in contact with other white men with big beards, many years before the Spanish arrival. Even Bartolomé himself went on Columbus' third trip to the archipelago and is the first eyewitness of these reports made by the local tribes. But the Treaty of Tordesillas for me, and for many historians, is the definite proof of the claim I'm making on this video. To understand the meaning of it and the risk the Portuguese king was taking at the time, we got to understand the lucrative business Portugal had in Asia. Europe was a heavy trader with Asia. At the time they used to import all kinds of spices and fabrics from the east at the cost of a big taxation of the Ottoman Empire when the products had to cross their territory. So when Bartolomeu Dias was able to cross the dangerous South African Cape and Vasco da Gama was able to reach India by sea for the first time, a new era for the Portuguese monopoly had started. Portuguese ships started to sail multiple times a year to trade with Asia and supply the huge demand there was in Europe for Asian exports. Ships started to arrive to Lisbon absolutely filled with exotic products desired by all the European countries, and Portugal didn't sell them for a bargain. It has been calculated that the Portuguese king would sell the contents of the ships for 60 times the cost of the whole voyage. So as you can imagine, the Kingdom of Portugal started to become literally one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Nothing would convince the King João II to risk to lose this insanely profitable business. Well, maybe one thing. When the Pope granted Spain the West territories, King João immediately lost his calm and demanded the Pope to overthrow this decision. He knew that by contradicting the Pope and the King of Spain, he was risking war with his closest neighbor, which although weaker at naval warfare, had a bigger population and would undoubtedly slow down the Portuguese trading with the East. The only thing worthy of a fight wouldn't be some little islands scattered across the Atlantic. No, the King João knew there was a large continent just waiting to be explored, and he was willing to risk his biggest business to not let Spain take America all for itself. It's unclear if the king knew about the abundance of gold in the region, or that there were complex civilizations living deep into the jungle, but even if he knew, it was clear that he tried to keep it a secret, sending only a few ships discreetly into that direction to not raise suspicions in Europe. A secret so well kept that unfortunately it remained a secret till this day. In this era of discoveries, it was crucial for Portugal to keep information away from competitors. Portugal was small, so in order to keep up with other European giants, it had to develop some tricks up its sleeves. If you want to know one of Portugal's secret weapons to become the first world superpower, please watch this video. Otherwise, you can present any argument either for or against this hypothesis down in the comments and we'll discuss about it. Thanks for watching. Obrigado.